Pardon me? No, we had a few more last time. I want to say we had 35 last time, so I guess I chased them away.
Oh dear. Does this work? I mean, is it?
Yeah, I think it's on.
Is it?
Mine's on,
Can you
definitely.
hear me? Should I
Can you put it a little closer to your mouth?
Mm-hmm.
And John will elevate it if he doesn't like the volume. Or Joel, rather.
There. That's probably better.
Okay, let's begin, shall we? Why don't I open with prayer? God, we thank you for this church and for the forums it provides that we can discuss difficult topics. We pray that you will send us your spirit this evening, that we might apply the wisdom of a crowd to some intractable problems in our world. Bless our speaker, Sue, this evening, and our class, our students, that we might hear and obey what you tell us in your holy word and through the wisdom of your disciples. In Jesus, amen. So this class, as you know, is called Imago Dei, the image of God, theological resources for a Me Too and Black Lives Matter world. Last week we looked at sexual harassment in the workplace, but we're discovering as we look at the lives of our neighbors that workplaces aren't the only dangerous places in our lives. That for many of us, home is a dangerous place too. So that's why I've invited Sue Priebe. Did you say Priebe or Priebe?
Priebe.
Priebe. Sue Priebe to speak to us tonight. I'm going to just launch her with a few questions. Sue is the clinical director at the Samaritan Center. She has offices in Winnetka, Oak Park, and the Old Town neighborhood of Chicago, right? She spends several days a week here in Winnetka. She worked for Diane Hart for a while, right?
I did.
So Sue has a PhD degree from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. In her day work, she specializes in treating depression and anxiety and motherhood issues and body image issues. And she, as I said yesterday at church, she is one of the persons I consult when I am baffled by the congregation's relational difficulties. So I'm so happy you came to see us tonight, Sue. So this is being live streamed, so jump in anytime, but wait for Kathy to put a microphone in your place before you ask Sue some questions. So Sue, let me begin here. I went to seminary too, of course, and we had pastoral counseling courses, and they warned us to be ready to talk to family members who were being abused by other family members in intimate relationships. But when I graduated from seminary in 1985, 33 years ago, it's been my experience that my parishioners don't talk to me about this. Maybe they don't want to admit to their pastor that their homes are not perfect.
Right.
But these folk do not approach people like me for this problem. So we don't see it. So is it out there? Is it happening?
Absolutely, it is.
How
Yeah,
often is it
unfortunately.
happening? Where is it
Yeah.
happening?
Yeah, well, let me just speak to what you brought up about how people might have a difficult time reporting domestic violence or other kinds of difficulties in the home. There's oftentimes a sense of shame involved with that, and also, sometimes, unfortunately, the culture of church and in our Christian faith in our lives, we don't want to admit that somehow things aren't right. And so to create, and one of the things that the research has been showing is that in order to actually solve this problem, one of the things that needs to happen is to have more access to services, which means we have to start talking about it. We have to start noticing when these things are happening. And so, yes, this is a very pertinent conversation to be having at this time, especially in communities where we would want to be really lifting up healthy relationships and have the opportunity to teach people how to live in relationship with one another, where they're honoring that image of God in one another and living with grace and love. And so to answer some of your questions, we do have some slides. Maybe this will work. Yes, trends. Thinking about how often this does happen, unfortunately more than what we would like to think. And also anyone can be abused. This does happen to men as well as women. However, women are predominantly the ones who are reporting domestic violence. And this is also perhaps a cultural issue where men do not feel as if it's okay for them to admit that they've also been hurt in domestic relationships. And also the statistic of 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been physically or sexually abused in their lifetime. So this is a problem not only for women but also for men, and yet we don't see a whole lot of change in those statistics. So anyone want to guess the number of American women who were murdered by a current or ex-male partner between 2001 and 2012? Any ideas?
250,000.
A lot, not quite that many, thankfully. 11,766. But to put that into perspective, how many American troops have been killed in conflicts in Iran or in Iraq and Afghanistan during the same period? Almost less than half, okay? So in terms of the amount of loss to our country, to our people, this is a problem that needs to be addressed. And also, just now, this is not this is not murdering, but the number of women who annually experience physical violence by an intimate partner. It's more than that.
20,000.
4 million, almost 5 million women are annually experiencing physical violence in their intimate relationships.
What would be 3 things that you would describe as that kind of violence?
Let's talk about let's see, I'll go back. We'll come back to that. The definition of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Abusive behavior as part of a systemic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another, and that's the definition by National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. As far as listing of different types of violence, I can just list off a couple things, and we'll talk more specifically about how to determine what is just an unhealthy relationship, what's a healthy relationship, and what's an abusive relationship. But physical abuse might be someone pulling your hair, punching, slapping, kicking, biting, choking. Obviously, those are physical things. Forbidding you to eat or sleep. That's also a physical that's a physical abuse. Hurting you with weapons. Preventing you from calling the police or from seeking medical attention would also be considered physical violence. Harming your children. Abandoning you in unfamiliar places. Driving recklessly or dangerously when you are in the car with them, or forcing you to use drugs or alcohol. This is not a comprehensive list, but those are some of the more unusual things. I mean, we would imagine actual striking or hitting, those kinds of things, but some of these other kinds of things also affect the physical body as well. And we can talk more about emotional abuse and other other kinds of things as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes.
Are the numbers that you quoted in the United States?
Let's see, here we have the percentages of women in comparison to the rest of the world. But the information that I have for that particular number, I can reference that. I believe it is United States. Most of my statistics are from the CDC or World Health Organization and also the Domestic Abuse Hotline. So the facts and figures. These are in the United States. Yeah.
What's striking to me about this slide, Sue, is that there's a fairly narrow range of incidents. So in the first world countries, it looks like 30%. In the second world countries, developing world, it's 30%. So that's fair. What it tells me is it's not culture that's producing this problem. This is a human, sort of an endemically human problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of difference between industrialized or developed countries and those who are developing yet. There is some slight difference for people who have higher education and also higher incomes, which has the lowest number of incidents at 23%. Those are for the higher income folks. But as you can see in this slide, the lowest percentage is 23, goes all the way up to, I believe, 37. So it is a narrow range. Obviously, it's not affecting every person, but it's a lot of people who are being affected by sexual violence or physical violence by a partner or a non-partner. So I'm going to go back again. I think we got those. Very good. Okay. So the intimate partner violence, the IPV behaviors, these are considered, domestic abuse behaviors are considered to be in this category if they arouse fear, prevent the partner from doing what they wish, force them to behave in ways they do not want. So those are the three areas. It's meant to produce fear in order for power and control issues, or preventing a partner to act in ways that would be who they are, restricting their freedoms. The behaviors include, obviously, the physical or sexual violence, threats and intimidation, emotional abuse, and also economic deprivation. And what's stunning is that 98% of domestic violence cases also include some sort of financial abuse, where a partner is prevented from accessing resources that would otherwise be available to their family, sometimes even not allowing them to access their own funds from their own work. Let's see. I do have a handout for you all if you'd like to have a copy of this. I'll just go ahead and hand this to you to pass out, because it's kind of small to read up on the screen. Actually, could I have one of those? So I can read it too? Thank you. Whoops. So this is a tool that is used to help people. Sometimes I see this in my practice where people aren't sure about, how do I know if this is abuse in my life? And so this power and control wheel is oftentimes a very helpful tool to help people identify if what's happening in their intimate relationship is something that is similar to abuse, or if it is abuse. And as you can see, the core of this always goes back to the issue of power and control. And that sense of being controlled and not having power in the relationship is one of the core issues with domestic violence. So I'm not going to read all of these things, but I thought if you wanted to reference this, you certainly could, and if there's any questions, certainly raise them.
There's no domestic violence in communities like ours, is there, Sue?
I wish I could say that's true. As you know, I do see folks in the Winnetka area, and unfortunately, a lot of people in this area also have domestic violence issues, and it's, again, people are not exempt based on income level, education. It can happen to anyone.
Bill, were you aware of much in Connecticut?
No. People like Sue, we had organizations like Samaritan Center in the community that we pastors worked with very closely, so they kept telling us it was happening, but we we didn't see it ourselves. People are very, very reluctant to tell their spiritual caretakers about their difficulties between parent and child and between husband and wife. There were a few high-profile front-page newspaper stories about very successful businessmen who would take a claw hammer to their wife, and the rage was just frightening, shocking and frightening. But now I wish I'd done my homework. That just occurred to me as Sue was talking. So we saw it in the newspapers when it escalated to that level, but anecdotally, we had, I should say I don't, maybe my colleagues have more experience of this.
So another question?
How much of this could we possibly tell is alcohol related?
Absolutely. Use of alcohol or harmful use of alcohol is implicated in, it's a higher risk for both the perpetrator and also if the victim is drinking. So alcohol use is definitely a risk factor for increased levels of partner violence. So that's a good point. Mm-hmm.
My understanding is that this is more men against women rather than women against men.
That is actually true.
Are you going to be coming to that?
Mm-hmm. In general, there's more reporting by women in their relationships, and again, it's hard to know because of only a fraction of those events are actually reported. But yes, one of the things that has been identified is that in those cultures where there's a more significant inequity between men and women, and there's more of a culture of acceptance of violence toward women, those cultures are going to have higher incidences of domestic violence against women. And so there are more incidents where women are the victims in domestic abuse situations. Mm-hmm.
Sue and I were talking before you all gathered here, and I said to her, maybe one of the virtues of a session like this is that it can heighten our awareness to our responsibility for our neighbors, that we are indeed our sisters and our brothers' keepers. So, but I also said, Sue, that you don't want to be looking for trouble in your neighboring homes either. So how can we be vigilant for trouble in our own and others' homes without being the local vigilante?
Right.
Vigilante therapists.
Right. Well, I think part of it, and I think one of the, going forward, we're going to have some more information about how to tell if you're in an abusive or unhealthy relationship. But I think that creating a space for a safe space for people to come to you and talk to you about the areas that they may have difficulty sharing about. So it's creating a community of understanding that the human experience is one of vulnerability, that we are not expected to be perfect, and our relationships are not going to be perfect. We just can't do that. And that especially the church is a healing community where you can come to find those places of safety and healing. And when you do that, I think you'll find more opportunities to have people come to you. And if you notice the things that we're going to talk about, maybe you can say, hey, are you struggling? Is this something that is a problem in your relationship? I know someone who can help. So that's what I would suggest. Definitely saying, being able to be open and vulnerable yourself and being able to be reflective on what your situation is, but also noticing if someone else might be struggling. So I'm going to, if it's okay to go forward
Absolutely,
with a few
sure.
other things.
Let me say
Yeah,
one
go ahead.
thing here a minute. So maybe it's possible that in a community where the lawns are preternaturally geometric and edged and cut, and where every crack is plastered over and there is never any soiled paint, on the houses, this problem might be driven more underground, that the exterior perfection might convince us that internally and privately we need to be more perfect too. Do you think that's the case? I'm making this up as I go along.
Well, you all live here, right? So, Diane?
One thing that I found is interesting, I recently changed internists, and I also noticed it at another doctor's appointment, but on the information form that we fill out now, they have added these questions about, do you feel safe at home? Something to that effect. So that was encouraging to me when I saw that on these forms, because I thought this is a safe place for, of course, I was thinking women, but for anybody then at their doctor's office too. So I suppose you could encourage somebody, if you're concerned about them, you know, to talk with maybe their doctor
Absolutely,
first, and
absolutely.
then maybe their doctor would refer them on for help in counseling.
Right. One of the other things that I've noticed too, the Oak Park Church, where I work, also the First United Church of Oak Park, they have put in their bathroom stalls sheets that you have little tear-off numbers for the domestic abuse hotline, and I thought that, and they're always they're increasingly gone. So every time I go to the bathroom, more people are finding that helpful.
Wow.
So I think that, you know, it definitely is something that churches can put out there, that this is a problem that is happening, and you know, maybe they're pulling the number for someone else, but it certainly is something that I think we as people of faith can be invested in getting the word out that there is help for people. Yes.
That reminds me of a curriculum.
Sure.
Do you know of any ideas or programs that are introducing these topics for young kids?
You know, I'm not sure of any particular curriculum, but I do know that the domestic abuse hotline has got a lot of good materials. This is where I pulled the physical violence, this power and control wheel from their website, and at the end I do have information as to how to contact them and where you can find that information. But I do think that one of the ways to prevent abuse in the home and with our young people is to create safe spaces for them, and also teach them what healthy relationships look like, where boundaries are important to keep, how to identify when someone is crossing those boundaries, and what to do about that. And so teaching healthy relationship skills, I think, is a good start, so that people can recognize when unhealthy relationships are beginning, and they can get help and find ways to get assistance.
Is your master's degree in sociology or in divinity?
I've got a theology degree and a psychology degree.
Okay.
And
So my guess is, Richard, that an undergraduate student who majors in women's studies, studying for a bachelor's degree, or certainly an MSW student, or somebody studying to be a therapist, would be introduced to these issues?
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is definitely something that professionals get to hear, but I think just the general
Just
population,
students.
how do you bring this to your children in Sunday school? You know, this is an important question. How do we model that for our children, for our communities, in our schools, in our churches? I think that's an excellent question. How to get that out there?
How do we bring it to the 10-year-old?
Oh, interesting.
That's what we do.
Yeah.
Do we study this, and should we study this in Sunday school?
Well, you know, how to treat one another, how to
Yes,
live in
absolutely,
grace,
yes.
definitely.
Yeah, yeah.
So one of the more subtle types of abuse is emotional abuse. And oftentimes, this is where I find people are questioning, something is wrong in my relationship, but I just feel bad about how things are going, and I don't know if I'm overreacting or what's happening. And this idea of gaslighting, anyone hear that term before? Do you want to say what you know by that?
I know the term itself comes from a play about domestic abuse, basically, and what it basically involves is turning your own version of events into something that they're overreacting to, something that, oh, you're just saying that, you don't really feel that.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Right. The play was from 1938, so this topic was pertinent back then too. But the idea is it's a form of emotional abuse that causes the victim to question their own feelings, instincts, and sanity. Go ahead.
Sue, what I was going to add to that, I just read something online about dating websites and using the term gaslighting. And they're now using this term, they're kind of pulling it away from this original use, and they're talking about the emotional abuse that comes from being phantomly dropped from an interaction through the dating website, so that people are connecting up on the websites, they're dating a couple of times, and then he or she gaslights the other one. And it's the connotation is the emotional abuse of not circling back and explaining why you've gone silent.
Ghosting, right?
Ghosting.
Oh, sorry, I have the wrong term.
No, that's interesting. That's kind of subtle abuse.
Emotional abuse.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
Don't you think?
Yeah.
Don't ghost people. Have the courage to.
Be direct.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So when a victim doesn't trust their own perceptions, they're more likely to stay in an abusive relationship. And I'm going to get to that question in a minute, because oftentimes people ask, well, why didn't you just get it out of there sooner? Or why don't you just leave, et cetera? We'll get to that. But this kind of gaslighting causes people to question their own perceptions and their own feelings. And so some of the techniques listed are these: withholding. The person pretends not to understand or refuses to listen. A person might hear their partner say, I don't want to hear this again. You're always trying to tell me the same thing. You're trying to confuse me. They might counter or by questioning the partner's memory by saying, you never remember things correctly. Your memory is bad. You're not remembering it right. That's not how it is. Blocking or diverting. They might change the subject or question the partner's thoughts. Saying you're imagining things, or trivializing, saying that their feelings and needs are unimportant, somehow saying you're too sensitive, you're just too sensitive, you're always overreacting, or forgetting and denial, pretending that they forget what occurred or denies things like promises made to the victim, telling them that you're making this stuff up, I don't know what you're talking about. And so the person, the victim is in a relationship, this is an intimate partner. You might be able to just disregard what someone else who's not important to you says. But if someone important to you is saying to you, oh, you're just too sensitive. You must be making this thing up. It starts to erode their sense of self, and especially if this is coupled with other kinds of put downs or other kinds of threats, then the person is likely to feel as if, oh, they're probably right. I'm forgetting things. I really don't know what I'm talking about. They might start feeling confused about their own sense of reality, and therefore be more apt to be controlled by and have less power in the relationship. So why don't people leave an abusive relationship? What are your thoughts on that?
It's complicated.
Complications, yes. Financial, definitely, yeah. What else?
Just saying they might not even know they're being abused.
It's hard to even know sometimes. They might be just used to it. This is what they're expecting in a relationship. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I would think if there are children involved, that would make it much harder to leave.
Definitely. Sometimes there are threats about the children too. If you leave, I'm going to hurt the children, or I'm going to take the children, or I'll never let you see them again. And given the history of the power differential in the relationship, the victim probably believes that that is a possibility. Yeah.
Also, if they grew up in a family where their parents were abusive, they might think that that's just the norm.
Yes, sometimes growing up in an abusive situation is another risk factor. Having witnessed other abusive situations, that might feel more normal. It feels familiar to be treated in that way. So let's look at some of what the other possibilities are, I'm sorry, it's kind of small. Fear, a person may be afraid of what will happen if they decide to leave. Believing the abuse is normal, that came up. Fear of being outed. This happens in particular for LGBTQ kind of relationships. Sometimes if they're in a relationship and they're not out in the general public and they want to leave a relationship, their partner might threaten, well, I'll tell. And that may be enough to keep them in the abusive relationship. Embarrassment or shame, and this I think is key for people in communities where it is not expected that these things happen, you know, in affluent neighborhoods or in church communities. It's difficult for someone to admit that they've been abused. They may feel that they've done something wrong by becoming involved with an abusive partner, and so they feel like it's somehow their responsibility too. Low self-esteem. When you're constantly put down, it's hard to know that you actually have the right to a happy life and to be treated well. And so not feeling like you deserve it yourself might keep a person in a relationship. And people still love their spouse. People still love their partner. And they might remember when they were not so bad and they want them to be back in that manner again. And so they hope for the best, and oftentimes the cycle of abuse is such that the abuser will show regret and make promises, and being, you know, ever hopeful, oftentimes the victim will say, well, maybe this time it'll be true. Maybe this time he really will change. Maybe this time it'll be different. And also, unfortunately, sometimes the victim will say, maybe if I'm better, maybe if I really work really hard on the relationship and do what he wants, then maybe he won't hurt me anymore. So the relationship, you know, whether or not you might call that love, people still feel love toward abusive partners. Cultural and religious reasons. Some cultures and religious backgrounds value more traditional roles, and it may influence them to stay longer in the relationship than would be safe for the person. Language barriers or immigration status, that is also an issue for couples. If they are not a legal immigrant, they're not going to go to authorities and say that I'm being abused. So that is another barrier for them. And finally, lack of financial resources. Again, remember, 98% of domestic abuse cases also have some sort of economic inequity, so that a person who is being abused is unlikely to have access to resources and don't have a place to go. Also, disabilities. Being in an abusive relationship is also a risk factor for actually having PTSD, depression, and other anxieties. And that type of disability makes it difficult for them to actually mobilize and initiate on their own behalf. So how do we discern healthy, unhealthy, and abusive behaviors? Should we look into that? Yeah, go ahead.
Could you go back to that slide?
Sure.
So I was looking at that question, and I rephrased the question, and I said, why do people enter an abusive relationship? And then I tried to answer that with all those bullets. And a lot of them, if you asked people that those bullets, they'd be like, well, no, I would never do that. What for? But it's an interesting starting point to help people understand the difference.
Sure.
Consequences of talking to somebody.
Sure. So basically what you're saying is that if we were to say, you know, if you feel fear in a relationship, should you go into one? They would say no. But oftentimes relationships don't start with that. And so, but I think what you're saying is if you're experiencing that now, why stay? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I'm saying that there's usually a timetable for people who are abusive. They can only get away for so long with a lot of those behaviors. How long is that? Is it 5 years? Is it 5 days?
In a new relationship, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Most people, again, though, if you have, I think someone said if abuse was modeled in your home, and it might feel like this is a familiar thing, you might consider this to be, oh, this is what happens in relationships.
Mhm.
And so, even if you start to experience fear or, some bad behavior, it might not be enough to keep you out of that relationship, unfortunately.
Maybe take them all as a whole then.
Absolutely.
Any of these qualify, then get out.
Yeah. Right. And this could be part of our relationship curriculum, right? If you experience this, question the relationship and look for something, look for ways to improve it and get out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, so also I've run into situations where not only younger people in their 20s, but older people getting married or remarried for a second time where they've been in a relationship and dating for quite some time, over a year, and then making a commitment, and they get into these relationships and later start to experience the abuse, that the person's able to hold off on that behavior until
Right.
they get a commitment. And so there's been some really sad situations where people newly married have come and said, now what?
Yeah,
You
what
know?
happened?
Yeah.
It was fine. And that's the thing. Oftentimes, abusers can be very charming initially. And again, part of in the center of that wheel is about power and control. And it may be, in those courtship times, it was more, it's wonderful that they take care of so many things. And then once the commitment is there, then they're taking over instead of just taking care of things. But was there a question in the back? Yeah.
I just wanted to share some advice that I thought was really good that my grandma gave me
Mm-hmm.
in college. She said, because I wondered if maybe people stay in a relationship because they don't think there's anyone else out there for them. And I broke up with someone in college, and I was very upset about it. And my grandma said, "Oh, Katie, boys are just like streetcars. Just wait a few minutes, and another one will be along soon." But I thought that was really good advice, and maybe other young people should hear that message.
Yeah. That's great. That's great.
Goes along to the self-esteem thing that
Yeah.
you are worth another honorable human being.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm glad you put the love up there.
Yeah.
That was kind of a revelation, a reminder to me. That abusers can be charming and the victims can still be in love with them. Does anybody watch Big Little Lies on HBO? It's
Yeah.
really very well done. Nicole Kidman is a woman in a very abusive relationship, and her husband is charming and successful, and he's always begging for forgiveness, and she takes him back. And the viewer just goes, "No, don't do this." But it's very well done. If you're all caught up with all your Netflix shows, look for HBO's Big Little
Yeah.
Lies.
Yeah, and I think, for a person to leave a relationship, like in that particular story, I've seen that
Have you?
show as
Yeah.
well. Your whole life, it's not just, stepping out of that relationship. Your whole life would need to change. I mean, and how would you manage that? And it is complicated. I think that was the first comment that was mentioned too. So healthy behaviors, I just thought I'd put that all up at once because hopefully we can all identify what that is. Healthy behaviors in a relationship. With communication, you talk openly, you listen and respect one another's opinions. You respect each other as you are. You trust each other, believing what your partner says. There's no need to prove your trustworthiness. There's no requirement that you need to prove it. You just trust each other. You're honest, but you can still keep some things private. You might have a conversation with a good friend and you may feel like you don't, it's probably not best to tell. You can keep things confidential. in certain circumstances, and your partner isn't demanding that you report in every moment. You're equal. You make decisions together and hold each other to the same standard of behavior. Personal time, you can enjoy a time apart, alone or with others. There's no monitoring of where you are or how long you're gone. Mutual sex choices. You can safely discuss your own choices and preferences, and there's mutual consent. There's no forcing or guilting into behaviors. Your economic partners, you have equal say in finances, even if the partnership is not necessarily equal in terms of how you're contributing. There's still an equal access and equal sharing in decision making. Supportive parenting, each parents in a way they feel comfortable with open communication regarding needs of both children and parents. So you're respected as a parent as well. So, seems like a good list of healthy behaviors. Your relationship may be unhealthy. Again, this may not be necessarily abuse, but it may be veering toward unhealthy if you're not communicating. Problems result either in arguments or avoidance. Now, all couples can have difficulties, all couples can have arguments, all couples can have people in their relationship who prefer to avoid conflict and maybe let things simmer too long before getting at them. And so if that's the case, there's room for improvement. You could likely improve your relationship and your communication skills. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're in an abusive relationship, but there might be some things that could improve. You might have some disrespect at times. You might have some lack of consideration of one another, feeling like my needs are a little bit more important than yours, so I'm going to do it this way now. But in general, that might be temporary or short term, and there's safety in saying, hey, I felt disrespected when you didn't include me in that decision, or when you didn't let me know that you were going to be late home from work. You have the safety of communicating about when these things occur. Not trusting. You might not believe what the other person says, or you feel entitled to invade their privacy. If you start wondering, I wonder what's on his phone, or I wonder what who she's talking to on the internet, that might say, oh, maybe we're not in the most open relationship. We need to maybe work on trusting one another, being more honest with one another. If one or more partners is telling lies, then again, that's not meeting that standard of openness, and you might be veering towards some unhealthy behaviors in the relationship. Trying to take control, again, feeling that one's desires or choices are more important. That, again, we're human beings. We tend to do this sometimes from time to time. But again, the key here is that there's not a domination or a control overall, and there's safety in being able to bring up the conflict and feelings surrounding these kinds of things. If your time is spent only with your partner and you have very few other outlets, or similarly your partner has very few other outlets other than you, that might signal that you might be becoming overly dependent only on their society, and it might be important for you to branch out and get a few more contacts. If there's any pressure regarding sexual activity, or there's guilt involved, saying, well, someone pouts, if they don't get what they need, that it can be, we're all human, this is true, but if it's something that is happening more often than not, or there's no safety in bringing up the concern that results as a result of that, then it might be somewhat unhealthy. If you're ignoring a partner's boundaries, assuming only one partner is responsible for making decisions, that's certainly veering toward an unequal partnership. And then again, unequal economics. Finances are not discussed, or it's only assumed that one partner is in charge of finances. That might be leaving one of the partners out and setting you up to feel that there's an inequality, and that might be a little bit more unhealthy. So this is a place, if you're taking stock of your relationship and you're like, that kind of sounds like me more often than not, you can get some help for that. It doesn't mean that your relationship is an abusive relationship, but it might need some assistance. Abuse is occurring if these things are happening. The communication is hurtful, threatening, insulting, or demeaning. There's mistreating. There's less respect for feelings, thoughts, decisions, opinions, or physical safety. Makes false accusations of cheating. Denies abusive actions are abuse by blaming the other, making excuses, or minimizing the abusive behavior. There's control, where there's no equality. One partner's making all the decisions without input from the other. Isolation controls where the partner goes, who they talk to, and may isolate them from family and friends. Forces sexual activity or even pregnancy. And there's economic control, where their money is controlled and access to resources is not equal. And dialogue about finances is not a safe option. Also, manipulative parenting, using children to gain power, and including telling the children lies about their parent. I've unfortunately had situations where the abusive partner is telling the children that their mother is crazy and that they shouldn't listen to her, things like that. And that makes it very difficult for the partner to leave, because they don't want to leave their children in the hands of the abusive partner. I'm asking all the questions here, Bill. Do you have any other?
I do have
Other
at least one
questions?
more, but you're on a
Okay.
roll, so you keep
Yeah.
going, Sue.
Is there a way to prevent abuse? And I think this, I wrote a couple things down here, because this is oftentimes what, when I have a person who's coming in who's in a situation that is sounding like an abuse situation, and it's important to not to somehow think that one partner is responsible by their behavior for the actions of the other. And I like to think about it in terms of that everyone is responsible for their own emotional reactivity. And there have been times when the partner who is the victim is saying to me, but he said that, if only I didn't make him so angry, he wouldn't hit me. If only I would have done this differently, he wouldn't have done that. And I like to remind them that even if she raises her voice, that doesn't give him license to push her or to take away her rights. And yet we all have our own responsibility for our emotional reactivity. That's what we need to be aware of. But if you are in a situation where someone is demonstrating the kinds of behaviors that we've talked about here, that does not mean that you are causing them, even if you are reacting to them. It is never the victim's fault. Okay?
That's a hard and fast rule.
Absolutely. Even, I think that you have to own your own behavior. If you're abusing, or if you are striking someone, or calling names, yelling at someone, those are things you can own yourself. And it might be going back and forth.
Yeah, I imagine
within
there
a
are
relationship.
a lot of situations where the relationship is mutually abusive, right? Where
Yes.
they are
Mm-hmm.
both, and that
Needing
sounds like
help.
a mess.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So what they have found in terms of risk factors, this is one of the questions that I think we've kind of gotten into a little bit already, but the World Health Organization has identified across cultures that lower levels of education, history of exposure to child maltreatment, and witness of family violence are for both victims and perpetrators. So if you have the lower levels of education or this history of exposure, you are at risk for both. You're more at risk to be a victim or to be an abuser if you've had those. Antisocial personality disorder is a risk factor for perpetration. Harmful use of alcohol, we had mentioned that earlier, that's a risk factor for both victim and perpetrator. Attitudes that condone violence is a risk factor for perpetrating, particularly gender inequality and norms on the acceptability of violence against women. Also the marital discord and difficulty communicating. So here's where, when we think about prevention, relationship skills early on, learning how to communicate so that there is adequate means to regulate emotion, and recognizing when a person needs to walk away, step away in their situation, rather than utilize power and coercion to get their needs met. So effective prevention, this is what has been found to be very effective. Advocacy and empowerment, which allows for improved access to services, so people know that there's help, right? So that they know that they're not alone. Economic and social development for women, skills training toward gender equality, communication and relationship skills for couples and communities at large, reduce access to and the harmful use of alcohol, transform harmful gender and social norms through community mobilization and group-based participatory education, which is what we're doing here, right? Having the opportunity to reflect on unequal gender and power relationships, finding out more about those dynamics and learning what is appropriate, healthy behaviors and what are not. One of the questions, I don't know if this is a question you were going to bring up, Bill, but can people who abuse their partner change?
It was.
Okay, great, great. Because I think that this is a good question. What do you do? Is it possible for people to change? And the answer is yes, but it really does take considerable commitment to owning their own behavior. It is not something that is easily cured. It's a decades-long continual transformation. The Domestic Abuse Hotline talks about batterer intervention and prevention programs, or BIP, B-I-P-P, which involve a full accountability, saying I am responsible for my own behavior and choices. No matter what my partner does, no matter how I might feel provoked, I am responsible for my choices and I can make amends. That's the whole focus of the intervention. That's where they need to end up. Being able to identify their patterns of their controlling behaviors and attitudes, developing respectful, kind, and supportive behaviors, carrying their weight in the relationship, and sharing power. So showing up in the relationship in a positive way, changing their actions in heated conflicts, and accepting the consequences of their actions. So if there is if there is a consequence that they may not be able to see their children without supervision or something like that, they cannot be blaming their spouse for that. They cannot be saying, blaming anyone else for the consequences of their behavior. Oftentimes people ask, why not anger management or couples counseling? And well, anger management classes or couples counseling might be helpful for those who are in unhealthy relationship patterns. It sometimes, if it is just applied to a person who's in an abusive situation, that examining of triggers to anger can just reinforce that idea that it's you that's causing me to do this. You're the trigger, instead of that complete owning of their own behavior and choices. And abuse is not a relationship problem, and that may imply if they do couples counseling, that if both parties are contributing to abusive behavior. Couples counseling can be very important after or as an adjunct to more of a batterer intervention program. Also, there have been times when couples counseling, if the therapist isn't aware that abuse is happening in the relationship, that the couple may be encouraged to air their grievances and practice communication in the therapy session, but on the way home or back at home, they really get hurt afterward because they shared a secret. They shouldn't have said what they said, and the therapist doesn't know that this is happening behind the scenes. Also, substance abuse and mental health treatment, again, can be helpful as an adjunct to a specific batterer intervention program. So basically, outcomes, we would hope for outcomes for change. You can probably read that bill. We are running out of time, so I don't want to keep you from any other further questions.
No, I don't have any others. I'd like to open it up to the group.
Yes.
Perhaps it's because I'm a woman, and I think that we all have people coming to us, who want to tell their story, and we're listening, and I'm not an authority. I think I can be a good listener, but sometimes I wish that I had all those sheets of paper in front of me that I had on the side, So I can just kind of say, have you thought about this or that, or have you looked at it? I mean, it doesn't mean that I'm not part of the need for this too. But trying to give advice to someone, as Bill said, how do ministers do it? Well, how do we do it as a friend when you don't really have experience, but you want to help?
Right. Well, I think, just having that intention to be a safe place where people can come and talk to you, and then being able to direct them to resources such as the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Their website is fantastic. I pulled a lot of my material from their website and found lots of articles. If you Google, you can find a lot of articles and resources that will help people self-identify that they might need help and where to go to get that help.
Any other questions for Sue while we've
Oh, go
got her
ahead.
here?
Go ahead.
I still like the idea of having a list of those things.
Sure.
Because to me, it makes me think, you could turn it over to someone and say, are you in this kind of a situation? Does this fit?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm. And so having that, having the, the power and control wheel, this, has numerous lists of, the types of things that people could see in oh yeah, that's something in my relationship. Wow, what do I do next? And then having the resources to direct them to getting help. Is that what you're asking for?
It is, but I have another question along that line.
Okay.
And I don't mean to dominate, but I think that we all like having language that can come up and say, I see how you're hurting. I see that blah, blah, blah. If we don't have the advice, I think we all need to learn the words to be a good listener and help them transition into something else.
Right, right. So even the words that you just used, I see that you're hurting. Is there something more I can do for you? Can I connect you with someone who can help? Those kinds of phrases, those kinds of questions, I think, are invitations to getting a person the help that they need.
I would like to see things like mandatory programs for people to get driver's license, to evaluate their communication skills. I would like to see the corporations be mandated to take, to enforce classes on people, real classes, not online classes, where they would have to interact with people and they would be evaluated. And these types of things, maybe they're in the future, but because it's a power struggle, we have to come up with ways to use power against these types of people and to train them and make them feel part of something bigger.
Love the idea.
Well, I know in some places in the world they start early in terms of lessons about respect and consent. I can think of several examples just from my own childhood of that's just boys being boys. Or he's just doing it to get a rise out of you.
So the message is then just, you're supposed to just let it happen and not react.
And that's where we can start early and start intervening.
Very good.
To Richard's question, Sue, do you think premarital counseling does any good?
Well, again, people are able to really,
I sort
hide things.
yeah, absolutely. I sort of require the couples I marry to go through. I talk to them for usually 5 hours, 1 hour on the ceremony and 4 hours about the marriage. And every once in a while, I think this is such a waste of time. Other times, I think I'm getting through.
Well, my experience with doing premarital is that oftentimes, there's a real motivation to show that they're ready to be married and that they're really in a good place. But I have seen some couples who are really wanting the help.
Okay.
They recognize the difficulties, and the system that we use Prepare Enrich. There's an assessment tool that allows them to see where they've got some incompatibilities, and then we talk about that. But yeah, I think it's most couples they're in premarital counseling because they want to be married, and sometimes those issues are flagged, and usually, the premarital counseling relationship is the foot in the door for the later problems, so that they know that if they have problems later, there's a safe place they can come back to. And that is something that we always put out there as an open invitation. And the expectation that relationships take work, it takes retooling and examining, and we like to have the open door for that. So.
Bill, to help you feel better, I had 2 daughters in the last few years get married, and both went through marital counseling, one with Bill. And both of them shared an interesting comment with me that they both felt they left marital counseling sessions, and the drive home was some of the most interesting conversations they had had. That you had raised enough issues with them, like, oh, we hadn't thought of that, or we should talk more about that. And then to Sue's last point, I think it's that they felt that they have a place they could come back to. If they had a
Thank you for
concern. So I
sharing
hope you
that.
feel better about that.
Yes, I do. Yes. And I think I probably have married 300 couples or so in my career. I probably stopped 2 or 3 bad couplings, which maybe that's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you very much.
Very, very well thought out presentation. So please join us next Monday night. Last week we looked at the creation story from Genesis 1. Joe Forrest is going to be looking at Genesis 2 with us. A very different story, but has wonderful, the dignity of humanity is lifted up in a very different way in that story. So please join us. Yes, if you can't be here, just go to kuc.org. Joel's back in the sound booth, manipulating the levers. Make it. We had 18 people live stream it last Monday. Which I was pretty. Was it good? Did it work for you? Great. Oh. Oh, great. Yeah. She, yeah. That's great. Thank you for that